Well, hello, and welcome back to our study of the Gospel of Mark. We are looking at the remarkable journey continues, looking at Mark 4 through 7. And as you can see on the screen that began and behind me, you'll note that the title of the unit is The Gospel of Urgency. On the other side, you can see that our lesson today is lesson 11, and we are going to be looking at more than enough. This is the feeding of the 5,000. We'll get into more of an introductory statement here in a moment, but for the meantime, just think about this for a moment. Of all the miracles Jesus performed during his ministry, this one, the feeding of the 5,000, is the only one that is recorded in all four Gospels. And we don't have time to make a lot of comparisons and contrasts between the four. I will, at this point, though, direct your attention to John's version of it in John chapter 6, where not only does he record the feeding of the 5,000, he has an extended discourse from Jesus outlining the significance of the feeding of the 5,000 and what that means in terms of who he is and why he's come and how people who come to know him will have eternal life. Mark, along with Matthew and Luke, will give us a narration of the event. And there are some little variations here and there. For the most part, we're going to stick with Mark. If necessary, I may bring in a comment or two about Matthew and Luke at this point, but and maybe John. But we're focusing on the Gospel of Mark, and so we want to see what he's doing and how he's presenting the gospel and how he's presenting this narrative. Well, let's get into it. First, I want to give you an introduction. Then what I'll do is walk through the outline of our text, and then we'll read it and go through it, as always, looking at verse by verse, phrase by phrase, and if necessary, and sometimes it is, look at specific words there that help us understand how Mark is presenting this material to us and how we can then kind of live within the text to see how Jesus is revealing himself and who he is and why he's come in the text. As we look at it, we're going to note real quickly that where we're starting is with the return of the disciples from their mission. Remember, 2 lessons ago, we looked at Jesus sending the disciples out on their mission. Last lesson, we looked at the interlude where John or Mark takes the time to talk about John the Baptist. Well, with this text, while we're going to be focusing on the feeding of the 5,000, we got to bring the disciples home. So we're going to do that. Let me go through the introduction then with you, and then we'll, as I said, go through an outline of the text and then read the text and discuss it. Really, by way of introduction, then it's something to think about. Jesus served a lot, and there were times when he would go rest. He would get away. We'll talk about a couple of examples of that moving forward. But it's important to recognize that serving others can be tiring, and the servant needs his rest or her rest. I know that there are times when those who look at what pastors and ministers do is not that important. Why do they get stressed? Well, there's a lot that goes into serving other people. And that's not just in the pastorate. It's anytime you serve other people. Anyone who has ever been in a place of service knows that sometimes that rest doesn't always come when needed. Just when you think you have a moment to rest, it's time to get up and do something else. We see that with Jesus' own ministry. We see that in this text with Jesus and his disciples. You see it in a number of other industries. Maybe a doctor gets a chance to take a quick break, but in the meantime, some emergency comes in and they've got to get up off the couch or the chair and get right back to work. You can think of many, many areas in life where that happens. Right now, I'm thinking even of the mom who works real hard to take care of the home. For the moment, gets rest after the baby's laid down, and as soon as she sits down, the baby starts crying. She's got to get up and get back to work. It happens in all walks of life. Jesus will give a pattern to address this, and we're going to see what we've just discussed. The disciples sit down, so to speak, get ready to rest, but needs arise, and they go and address them. Well, that's going to be the first few verses. After informing the reader about the fate of John the Baptist, Mark returns to his narrative of Jesus. And the disciples return from their mission, but the work of Jesus and that of the disciples is not done. Now, there is more ministry to come. Now, while Jesus wishes to give the disciples a bit of rest, as we've talked about, such rest will not come right away. Crowds met them, and we'll read about that. Jesus changed course from helping the disciples get rest to right back on track to meet the spiritual and physical needs of the crowd. And the disciples then will learn that the gospel of the kingdom carries with it that sense of urgency when the need arises. What the disciples will learn and what we will learn is that the important lesson here is trusting Jesus enough to follow his instructions so that he can bring to completion the work he's called them to do. Another aspect of his work. Jesus is trying to train the disciples regarding ministry and the need for rest, but he also demonstrates for them that there is a time to get back up at it. And in this lesson, a byproduct is that when Jesus supplies, he supplies all that's needed and more. Clearly, though, the ultimate goal of this text is to give us one more piece of evidence of who Jesus is and the way he's able to meet needs. Here is a miracle that is about meeting needs, but the miracle speaks to a bigger issue, and that is, who is Jesus? Well, as we get started, let me go ahead and give you the outline that we're going to be following. We're going to be looking at Mark chapter 6, verses 30 to 44. And as we do, we're going to break it up into about 5 parts. You can see here the first part we're going to look at will tie together the end of the previous narrative with the disciples coming back from mission and then move into the feeding of the 5,000. So we're going to see the apostles return from the mission. Then we're going to see verses 33 to 34, a large gathering around Jesus. Now, technically, they won't be around Jesus yet. They'll get there, but Jesus will respond to that large gathering. As they meet where they're going to go in verses 35 to 38, we'll see what I just call later in the day, what goes on as the day goes on. Then fourth, the distribution of food. We know it's the feeding of the 5,000, so we're going to read about Jesus making available the food to the crowds, verses 39 to 41, and then we will conclude with the end results. And I think that Mark is going to be guiding us not just to think about the end results in terms of the physical nature of the results, verses 42 to 44, but we will be able to look at the spiritual results as well. What is it that we learn about who Jesus is as we go forward? Well, let me read the text, and if you'll bear with me, there are times when I would break up a text like this into its smaller parts, but I want us to get the full flavor of this narrative. And as we do, listen carefully, pay attention to a lot of the code words that we've identified in Mark's narrative, and walk through it and experience it as it happens. I think the New American Standard Bible 2020 edition does a really good job of blending that word for word with the dynamic equivalent, giving us a sense of what Mark is trying to do with the text and how he's narrating the story. And what I want us to do then is see how he uses the literary devices that he does so as to help us experience the text, if you will. Hopefully my reading of it will reflect that, but mostly what I want you to do is vision in your mind what Mark is trying to do. Again, we're going to be looking at Mark 6, verses 30 through 44. Let me go ahead and read that, and then we'll go back and follow our outline. Mark says this: the apostles gathered together with Jesus, and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a secluded place and rest a little while." In parentheses then, for there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. And they went away in the boat to a secluded place by themselves. Beginning verse 35 or 33 then, the people saw them going, and many recognized them and ran there together on foot from all the cities and got there ahead of them. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And when it was already late, his disciples came to him and said, "This place is secluded and is already late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he, Jesus, answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go look." And when they found out, they said, 5, and 2 fish. And he ordered them all to recline by groups on the green grass. They reclined in groups of hundreds and fifties. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up toward heaven, he blessed the food and broke the loaves, and he gave them to the disciples again and again to set before them. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 12 full baskets of the broken pieces of bread and of the fish. There were 5,000 men who ate the loaves. There's a lot going on there, obviously, and we'll try and walk through that as we can little by little. Let's pick up first, of course, with the first section of our outline, that section entitled The Apostles Return from Their Mission. Kind of tying this together before we talk about the meaning of the text itself, the verses narratively then bring to conclusion what started in chapter 7 or chapter 6, verses 7 through 13, where Jesus sends them out. You want to go back and read that text and also look at that lesson. This is the second part then of what we've called the sandwich narrative. The first sandwich narrative we saw was with Jairus's daughter and the woman with the hemorrhage. He starts off talking about the girl, Jairus's daughter, being sick, as Jesus is going to meet with Jairus at his home to heal the daughter. Jesus is interrupted, so to speak, by the woman with the issue of blood. And so we see that tied back together. A number of comparisons and contrasts we can make in those episodes, but I want to call you back to read that lesson as well. There's something like this going on here. Some have suggested whenever there's a sandwich narrative like that, there's some kind of connection between the outer and inner parts. You might be able to look back at what John has to say or what Mark has to say about John the Baptist, and how that might apply here. For the most part, though, we know narratively and historically what Mark has done here is he's reported for us the disciples going out on mission, and now he's recording their return from mission. There's something that you'll see hinted at, and we talked about it briefly when we talked about sending out the apostles. We'll see it again here. What Mark does and what he calls them as they return. We bring that back so Jesus can then take them on to the next level. So go back and look at the narrative about John the Baptist, and maybe you can find some connection between John the Baptist and then the narrative of the disciples out on their mission. But we do bring that to conclusion here. Chapter 6, verses 7 through 13 is the narrative of them going out on mission. So what you have here then is the return. John, or Mark, I keep saying John because John the Baptist, Mark kind of ties things up, and he's guiding us through the narrative in a logical, sequential way. What's going on then? I want to tie in a couple of things for you. Verse 30 reports their return, and it says, the apostles gathered together with Jesus, and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. Notice what happens here. He calls them apostles. First, the response, the narrative, they gathered together. Now, the verb is in the passive. They were gathered together. It's almost as if Jesus calls them back together. To say they were gathered together works just fine. There may just be something a little bit more meaningful with the idea of they were gathered together. It's like Jesus would pull them in from their mission. Now, they went out two by two. It's hard to say if they came back two by two. In other words, were they then at that point coming back in folds of two by two all at the same time, or had they been returning and now they're in with Jesus? That's not the most important thing, but what I want you to see is Mark relating this. They were gathered together. And so what happens is they were away and they've come back. And then Jesus is going to want to minister to them in a certain way. The other thing is that this is using kind of a present tense as if they are being gathered together. It's an ongoing action. Again, we've seen what Mark does with the present tense here. We'll see it translated in the past tense, but it's a historical present indicating that as we read it, we want to actually experience it as it's happening. We're watching it almost live, or at least by way of some kind of video. What you then see here is Mark detailing for us watching the disciples return. Now, the other thing is rather interesting about this. He calls them apostles. Now, I tried not to use that word. I slipped a minute ago. Tried to keep the word disciples there because when they went out, they were called disciples. Here, Mark refers to them as apostles. Now, a couple of things about that, and maybe pick up on what we've said before. Apostles means those who are sent out. Okay, they were sent out by commission, and that's rightly the case here. They're called disciples. They are students. They are learners. Scott McKnight, in his translation of the New Testament, calls them apprentices, and I think there's a validity to that because they're learning not only from Jesus, but to learn to do the things Jesus did, and they are coming back having done the things that Jesus did, and they'll report that in a moment. But they're called apostles. Now, what's interesting about that is we think of them as apostles all the time, but the Gospel of Mark only uses the term apostles for the disciples here. Matthew only calls them apostles once in his narrative. Luke does a few times. John doesn't use it at all. We do see it in the book of Acts, though. Rather, Mark refers to them as disciples 40 times. But I think it's appropriate to call them apostles now. One, because that's how they're designated in the narrative. More precisely, Jesus, when he calls them the 12 out of the group, he says he called them or designated them as apostles. The thing we need to recognize is now, from a narrative perspective, it's right to call them apostles because they have been sent out and they have come back. We will see that that means more moving forward. There's a certain authority that is going to be bound up with them being apostles as we move forward in the early church. But they were sent out and they've come back. So the word apostello means I send out. The word apostolos is the one who is sent out. You see the verb and the noun sound very similar, so you get that word play. They are apostles, rightly so. What's happened now is that these sent ones have come back from their first mission. What we see then is Mark tells us they reported to him, to Jesus, all whatsoever things they had done and whatsoever things they taught. I'm giving you my literalistic type of translation here because I want you to see, while the New American Standard 2020 says all that they had said and done, the word all or whatsoever is there twice. Not just all things said and done, but all whatsoever, all inclusive of what they had done and all inclusive of what they had taught. Mark is now telling us in a comprehensive way, although in a very brief way, what the disciples reported. Now, whatsoever, that little whatsoever things is a one pronoun, but it appears twice. And so I wanted to see you gather that up together. Now, the question is, what had they done and what had they taught? We'll go back to Mark chapter 6, verse 13. It talks about them casting out demons and healing the sick. They taught for people to repent. And so basically, what the disciples are doing, now called apostles, is saying, here's all that we've done. Now, you can look at parallels to this, and there's a certain sense in which on one occasion they come back from mission and they talk about how the demons believed, or excuse me, the demons obeyed them and as they were cast out. And Jesus said, don't rejoice necessarily in that, but rejoice that your names are in the book of life. So he's trying to keep them in perspective. Ultimately, the things that they did were not of their own authority or of their own power. They were given that authority by Jesus, and it was by the power of God and the Holy Spirit that they were able to do these things. The key is that Mark is letting us know they fulfilled the mission that Jesus sent them on. They went out and preached, and they were able then also to cast out the demons and heal the sick. What you're going to see in other parallel passages, even reference to the lepers and people who were cleansed of their leprosy and so forth. Clearly, they were obedient, and there's a model there for us. They go out on that mission, they come back, being able to report that they've done all that Jesus said and done, or that the disciples had said and done. Then in verse 31, Jesus then responds to them. He says this, come away by yourselves to a secluded place and rest a little while. Um, Mark then puts in parentheses a kind of explanatory statement. He says, for there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they've returned. People are gathering. He says, we've got to go. Let's go somewhere else. Let's get you to a secluded place. You'll see that word in a moment again, and then rest a little while. They were busy, and when they had an opportunity to rest, they were becoming more busy. Jesus is trying to send them off to another place, still to get rest. So Jesus' response to the disciples was to call them away to a place of rest. They had come back from their mission, and notice the command, come. He says, you yourselves come by yourselves, literalistically. And that means basically according to yourselves or by yourselves. In other words, let's come be alone. Let's go do this and let's find yourselves a place where you can be by yourselves. And the idea there is you can be alone and according to your own self. The idiomatic expression then is about being separate at that point and to be in a private place. He's hoping and wanting for them to have that place of seclusion, that ministry that they perform. We don't know how long they were gone. We don't know exactly when they returned, but upon their return, Jesus knows that they need to rest. They have been expending themselves. They've been faithful to the mission, and now they need that rest. So Jesus then goes on to direct them to a secluded place. The word here generally means a deserted or desolate place. In this context, though, it has the idea of just being desolate of people, not being in the desert, but being separate from the people. He was moving them to a place away from crowds and away from work. It was thus a solitary place, as many translations render it. It's the same expression that you see used in Mark chapter 1, verse 35, where Jesus wakes up early in the morning, he goes off to pray. Um, to a place alone, to a secluded place to pray. As some translations say, he woke up a great while before day and went off to pray. Well, Jesus' exhortation for the disciples to find a solitary or secluded place was so that they could rest for a little while. That's interesting. To get some rest. As the word here, rest, the word for rest here conveys the idea of refreshing and taking a time away from their work. And of course, a little while, get what you can, as much as you can for the time being. Mark offered an explanatory note, as we've already mentioned, that helped us to see that Jesus wanted to get them away. They needed to have that time. There were many people coming and going. And again, as you read the text, I want you to envision this. Envision them coming back from all their different missions. Jesus is wanting to kind of give them something to eat, help them rest, and the people are coming and going because we really need to go somewhere else. So they go somewhere else. Now, what we're going to find is they get on a boat to go somewhere else, and the people are going to follow them. We'll talk about that in a moment. But notice all that Jesus is trying to do. I hope that you are able to envision this. Sometimes the familiarity of a text keeps us from reading really detailed and enjoying and envisioning all this taking place. We end up just reading past it and maybe trying to quote the high points. But we need to focus in on what Jesus is trying to do. They arrived at a busy place. They get there, they're with Jesus, they're reporting, but it's busy. Already there appeared to be a crowd seeking the attention of Jesus and the disciples. It was busy to the point that they did not have time to eat. Can you imagine? They get ready to sit down and people are gathering and they need to go. They can't even eat. The phrase "they did not have time" reflects the verb eukaireo, a good time, and it's related to the adverb well-timed that we saw back in Mark 6:21 when we talked about how it was an opportune time for Herodias, the wife of Herod Antipas, to have John the Baptist killed. That good time. It was well-timed. It was an opportune time. Here, that same kind of word is used. They were looking for a good time to eat. They didn't even have a good time. It wasn't an opportune time, to say it that way, for them to eat. What we see then is they try and are unsuccessful. Ultimately, what Mark is saying with these words is there was no good time to eat. And so what happens? Jesus tries to give them rest. They're being bombarded with people coming and going, interrupting in some way, and Jesus says, let's go. There wasn't even time to eat. Verse 32, they went away in the boat to a secluded place by themselves. There's that secluded place. That's not the last time we're going to see the word. It's the second time. But what's happening? He wanted to take them to a secluded place. Mark tells us they go to a secluded place. So here's what Jesus does. He directs them. And there's three things that we see. They went away. Second of all, to a secluded place, and third, by themselves. Now, you might think I'm overdoing it by breaking it up like that, but I want us to see the different stops along the way, the different emphases here. They went away from the crowds to a secluded place, separate, and then by themselves, which emphasizes the fact that that's what they intended to do. That's what their plans were. Now, actions 2 and 3 repeat the terms that Jesus had used in the commands to them when he said, let's come away to a secluded place by yourselves or according to yourselves. So we're trying to see it happen. Jesus is trying to give them that rest that he believes they need. What we're told then is that this happens by way of them getting in a boat. And again, we see them traveling by boat all over the place in the Galilee, back and forth across the lake here and there. They're going to use the boat for a short distance anyway. We're not told how far away. We can always look on a map where the feeding of the 5,000 took place, but certainly they are going to get on a boat to try and go somewhere else. Now, the reader, as we've said, has seen, and you as the reader have seen Jesus and the disciples going by boat all over the place. Now, the many people coming and going also necessitated this. They would often walk or go back and forth by boat, but since walking on the land to get away would only welcome the crowds to accompany them. So let me rephrase that. Why did they get on the boat? They got on a boat because the people coming and going really made that necessary. Because if they were to stay on shore, then the people would be around them. And what we need then is for them to get where they're going. You'll see, as we've already read, they're not really successful to get that place alone. And it's, for my mind's eye, rather not just comical. I wouldn't say humorous in a negative way, but certainly eye-opening. And I'll give you an analogy or an illustration of what I see kind of taking place here, maybe from a familiar analogy that you've seen in pop culture before. But as will be seen, their leaving by boat did not dissuade the crowds from following. So they get in a boat because if they stay on land, they'll be followed. Their getting in the boat didn't stop the people from following them. While Mark did not indicate the location of the secluded place, we do know that Luke 9:10 says something about Bethsaida. There are some challenges in reading Mark's version of the feeding of 5,000 with Luke's, where all that takes place. We won't hammer that out right here. Just know that there is some debate about that feeding of the 5,000 and where it took place. Ultimately, though, we know they go somewhere else. And that's pretty interesting what Mark is going to report for us as the crowds follow. Let me just say this, though. Jesus cared that the disciples be able to experience a time of refreshing and to eat. And maybe they needed to regain strength after the expense of effort and energy that they gave on the mission, and now they have returned. One of the things you have to remember, is that when Jesus sent them out, he said, don't take food, don't take these things. He's making them dependent upon the people they would minister to provide for them. Who knows how much they were able to actually experience that. We don't know how long they were gone. Maybe they didn't eat well enough. And Jesus wants to do that. Part of the eating is regaining their strength. Stop down for just a quick second and think about this. We could look at the theme of them eating. Remember when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter, he says, give her something to eat. Here, he's wanting to give them something to eat. The thing we need to recognize is as he's trying to give them something to eat, experience a time of refreshing, he is himself has already modeled this practice. We've already mentioned Mark 1:35. If you go back and look at Luke 5:16, that points out that Jesus did this on a regular basis. He would minister and then get away. He would minister and then get away. What Mark does here is he recounts this getting away by using what we call the imperfect tense, an ongoing action in the past tense. Not Mark, but Luke. Luke makes the point that this was a regular thing in Jesus' ministry. He would work and minister, then try to get away. And he also uses the plural form of the same word used in that Mark is using in this passage. The idea there then is Jesus got away for different opportunities to pray. Yet another practice that he modeled for his disciples. So there are various things that Jesus would do when he would get away. Try to rest, eat, and refresh, and pray. So as Jesus was doing that, modeling it, now he is wanting the disciples to that. And in doing this, he's demonstrating the necessity of getting away for a time of refreshing after significant ministry. He wanted to get them away for their short season or their own short season of solitude. And that comes from the fact that he said, for a little while. Where are we then? Well, they're in the boat and they're trying to get away. They make it to a secluded place to be by themselves. Here's where I will see some of the humor, if you will, or at least the visual will be somewhat humorous, though meaningful. I don't want to take away the significance of it. But what we then see in verses 33 to 34 is this large crowd around Jesus. So Jesus and the disciples leave for the secluded place. They do find solace or solitude for some respite, but it won't last. It won't last even if it hadn't even started. Let me rephrase that. If it started at all, it didn't last. And when you read the text, it doesn't sound like they got any rest, really. Listen to what Mark says, and again, in your mind's eye, envision this, and I want to give you an illustration. Verse 33 says, the people saw them going, and many recognized them and ran there together on foot from all the cities and got there ahead of them. It's a really compelling picture, of course, of what happens. You see Jesus in the boat with his disciples. You see they left the crowds, but as the boat is going along the way, the crowds are following. And what Mark tells us is people were coming from all the cities and getting there And actually, how they knew where they were going, it's hard to say. They get there before Jesus and the disciples. Notice the things that happened. Those coming and going, they saw Jesus and the disciples as they were going away. Then they were recognizing that, well, that's Jesus and his disciples. So as if the crowd did not pay much attention to them as they were coming and going and being busy, um, maybe because of the regularity of the events of people coming and going in boats, the people recognize them as Jesus and the disciples, and so they move. And it speaks to the fact that the crowd, the ones coming and going, are now jumping into, not jumping in, but following along. The who knows? The crowd could be turning over with all the coming and going, but now when Jesus and the disciples leave, you find them starting to follow and they go after him. Many in the crowd saw but didn't initially react, but then they recognized Jesus and the disciples, as I said. And I know I've stumbled on it. I'm trying to convey this picture and I'm kind of muddling it up a little bit. The coming and going takes place. Jesus is saying it's too busy here. They get ready to leave. Amongst those coming and going, there's an effect of recognition that it's Jesus and the disciples. So those that recognize start to go. They start running on foot. So the third thing happens is they run on foot. And here's the thing, people start coming from different cities. Imagine the crowd building as the disciples and Jesus are on their boat moving along. We don't know how far offshore they are. They're going along, and people are gathering, and the crowd is increasing and increasing. Mark says they're coming from all these different cities. And it's as if there are two illustrations that I think of. One is, they're not both great, but one is like the Pied Piper, where the piper goes through town and all the mice and whatnot and the rats that follow him. Of course, he's trying to get rid of the rats. That's why it's not a good example. But you start to see them all come from everywhere. And I'm certainly not equating people with rats. Another one that I like, and that's because I'm old and I like this movie series, is Rocky. And in the first Rocky movie, and Rocky is training to fight Apollo Creed. You see him training, and one of the training scenes is where he's running through the city. He's already gaining in popularity because of the anticipation of the fight. And as he's running early in the morning, you start to see kids and others following him. And what happens is, as he's running through the streets, people are coming out of their doors and out of their buildings and out of their homes, and they're running along with him until he gets to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And there's this big crowd that catches up with him, and he is cheered on because of the running. Rocky's not Jesus, but the attitude that the people had toward Jesus when they recognized him was such that they wanted to have a part of him. They wanted to be with him. And I can just see as the crowd is growing, as the disciples and Jesus are going along the shore before they land, they're all gathering. And as Mark said, when they finally get there, they got there already. In other words, by the time Jesus and the disciples get to the land, the crowd is already meeting them. And so he takes them away for rest, but it doesn't seem like they get rest. Notice what Mark says in verse 34. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Think about this. While Jesus wants to give them rest, the disciples, for all the work that they've been doing, this crowd eager to have some learning, some hope from Jesus, run, get to where he's going to be before he gets there. And you can just see, if you will, him melt. He sees the crowd and he has compassion on them. Mark says he sees them like sheep without a shepherd. Now, Mark doesn't emphasize the shepherd motif here like John will in other places where Jesus calls himself the good shepherd. But that image is there. Jesus is the shepherd, and he sees sheep that need help. Mark records the actions of Jesus in four stages. So there were four stages that we find the crowds following in Jesus, and there are four stages here. First, the activity that preceded the three main actions, and that is this. Jesus, or he says originally, Mark says he went when he got out. In other words, got out of the boat. That's my translation. When he got out. So that happened first. There's not a reference to the boat necessarily, but that's implied by the text, by the way the description is given. They were on a boat, so when it says they got out, clearly he's getting out of the boat. But it's implied as the comment parallels and contrasts, so they're going away in a boat. So when they get out, clearly they're getting out of the boat. He and the disciples arrived at their destination. So getting out of the boat necessarily entailed going on shore. So that's the preliminary activity. But then secondly, notice this, it says Jesus saw the crowd, and the crowd saw and followed him. Now he saw them. So they were following him initially. Now he sees them. Also, as he has done and will do in other places, Mark described the crowd as large. Now, here are some places where Mark refers to the crowds as large. Just take note of these. Mark 4:1, 5:21, and 24. Mark 8:1, Mark 9:14, Mark 10:46, and lastly 12:37. In other words, Jesus with the crowds was commonplace. Well, then note the third thing that happens. When he saw the crowd, he felt compassion for them. He was moved with compassion. He had sympathy for them. He felt pity for them. The emotional statement derives from a word having to do with the bowels, that compassion, that pity. And the bowels were the seat of the emotion. What we're seeing here is similar to what we find in 1 John when he talks about having compassion on people. The reason for this response, the reason for this compassion, Mark tells us, is from what Jesus saw, he likened them to sheep without a shepherd. Now, like I meant nothing negative with the Pied Piper. Here, clearly, Mark doesn't mean anything negative when he looks to record what Jesus does, and likely he gets this word considering them like sheep without a shepherd because there are places where that reference is made. They're like sheep without a shepherd. There's this large gathering. It's like a herd. There are people hopeless and needing help and wanting the hope that can come from a relationship with God and all that Jesus has promised and all that Jesus has already provided. Jesus has compassion. They had no guide, no protection, no direction, like sheep. The analogy then used to describe Jesus' assessment of this specific crowd, Matthew used as a description of Jesus' response to the crowds in general. So a moment ago, I mentioned there were places where Jesus actually used that language. Here, Mark is reporting that's how Jesus saw them, even if Jesus didn't use those words. Well, in Mark 9:36, there is that wording. They're adding, they were distressed and downcast like sheep without a shepherd. Perhaps Jesus saw the same in this crowd as well. A different crowd where he has that concern. Here's another crowd. Fourth, then, he began to teach them many things. Jesus did what Jesus did, and it's what he would typically do. He didn't turn the crowd away. He didn't turn them down. He didn't rebuke them. While he was trying to get away initially, helping his disciples get some rest, he saw the crowd, and the need of the moment arose, and he met the need. His compassion wouldn't let him walk away. He was a teacher, so he taught. So he does this on and on for a long period of time. And what happens later in the day? Mark tells us in verses 35 to 38. We'll break this up into verses 35 and 36, and then we'll look at 37 and 38 together. Verses 35 and 36. When it was already late, his disciples came to him and said, "This place is secluded, and it is very late already. Send them away so that they might go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." It's not like the disciples don't have compassion. They're thinking this is a long way away from places. If they're going to eat, we need to let them go now so that they can go because there's nothing here. And if we wait too long, quote, places are going to close. So he began to teach them, implying that he taught for a while. And what also lets us know that he taught for a while was the fact that it was getting late. We don't know when Jesus and the disciples met that day. We don't know when they met, then traveled to the Galilee or traveled the Galilee to go to the other place, when they met the crowd, and we don't know when he began to teach. It just says he started to teach. And we know that he taught for a while because, as Mark says, it was already late. Now, this is an attempt to convey what the original says, when already many hours had passed. That's what it literally says. I've tried to convey that here. To say it was already late is good, but notice many hours already passed. So they were there a long time. After the many hours, the disciples approached Jesus with a concern for the crowd. As we said, they're not trying to get rid of the crowd because they don't like the crowd. They're concerned that the crowd is going to run out of time to go and get food. They're in a secluded place. They need to go into the surrounding villages and towns and buy themselves something to eat. So there is concern. The time is of the essence. If the crowd didn't leave soon, they wouldn't get any food. So they appeal to Jesus saying, we know you're teaching and everything's good, but it's late and they need to eat. Jesus has his own solution, verses 37 to 38. He answered them and said, "You give them something to eat." And they said, "Shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give it to them to eat?" And then he says, "Well, how many loaves do you have? Go and look." And when they found out, they said they had 5 and 2. Well, let's walk through this real quickly. He says, "You give them something to eat." Now, their thinking is, well, we've got money, but we have to go. But the other thing is 200 denarii going to be enough? Will that be enough to give them to eat? So there's concern there. Now, they don't know what Jesus is going to do. We know in other accounts of this feeding of the 5,000, Jesus already knows what he's going to do, and we're privy to that. But he says, you know what? You give them something to eat, and the way you're going to do it is first you're going to go out and look and see what you have. Now, we know that they go out and maybe they're looking among the crowds. John tells us specifically that they find a little boy who has lunch with him, and he has 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's where we get the 5 loaves and 2 fish in the Gospel of Mark. John tells us specifically that they got this from another boy. They didn't collect it from different people. There was one boy who had his food. So they gather it up. And how many do they have? They say 5 loaves and 2 fish. So there's not a whole lot that we need to add to that, but it is interesting that Jesus is challenging them to think about how this is going to take place. They're thinking in the very realistic way of the money that's involved and the time going. I mean, if they're going to send if they're going to send the crowds away on time, they'd have to go on time. Clearly, they could travel faster than a whole crowd. But Jesus said, "You look, go out and look and find out what you have." And they come back with these 5 loaves and 2 fish. And what this means then is that they are able to take what Jesus has, and it's been said in other gospels, but how will this go among so many? Now, it's important to recognize, and we've read the text already, so you know where this is going. But it's important to recognize if you're reading right now, you don't know how long the crowd or how large the crowd is. We just know that they're coming from different towns and villages. And it's a large crowd. That's what Mark says. We don't know how large a crowd it is. But think about this: 5 loaves and 2 fish. How is that going to go among so many? By the way, side note, we won't have time to get into this, but we're seeing Jesus perform a miracle similar to what we see in the Old Testament with Elijah feeding. I think it's Elijah or Elisha. Probably shouldn't bring it up if I don't have the exact name. But he feeds 100 people. What Jesus is doing is going to compound that exponentially because we're going to see how many he feeds with these 5 loaves and 2 fish. So it's even more powerful, more dramatic in what he does in feeding them. So we have the scenario set. We have the crowds, we have the disciples with the food, and now what we see is Jesus making a way for the people to be fed. So we have in verses 39 to 41 the distribution of the food. And here's what Mark says. He ordered them all to recline by groups on the green grass. They reclined in groups of hundreds and fifties, and he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed the food and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples again and again. And that word again and again, that phrase is in italics in the New American Standard. We'll talk about that in a moment. And he says again and again to set before them, and he divided the fish two among them all, or the 2 fish among them all. Well, when Jesus is presented the fish and the loaves by the disciples, he orders them to have all the people sit down. They were reclining, which is the typical posture of eating. If they were at a little table, they would recline anyway, but they sit down. And they were going to recline on the grass where they were. John 6:10 notes that there was plenty of grass, which is interesting. Mark, alone of the 4 Gospels, describes the grass as green grass. He gives that added detail. The note in John 6:4 that Passover was near, in addition to these 2 descriptions of the grass, point to the time of year that this gathering occurred. So we're talking about late winter, early, right into spring, right around the time Passover was to begin. Maybe the green grass is that things are starting to come back to life. But notice those details. That shouldn't be lost. That it's good grass, it's a lot of grass, and it's green grass when you put all the Gospels together. So there's plenty. So there's a soft place for them to sit. The grass was plenteous enough and green enough for John and Mark to, quote, stand up and take notice. In other words, they noticed it, they reported it to us. Mark probably relating that from Peter, who was the witness there on that day. Regarding the groupings of company by company, Verse 40 records that they divided up into groups of hundreds and fifties. Again, there's no indication yet in Mark's account of how many people were in the crowd, but this kind of grouping, talking about hundreds and fifties, along with the disciples' concern of the deficiency of funds to feed them, justifies Mark's calling it a large crowd. So again, if you're reading along slowly and letting this unfold before you, you're going to get a sense of how large the crowd is. And even Mark, when it's all said and done, doesn't tell you the full number of people that are there. In further meticulously detailed fashion, Mark describes what Jesus did next. Pay close attention to this. With everyone seated in their respective groups, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. He then looked up to heaven, which was the common posture of prayer, and he blessed the food. He gave thanks for it. He blessed it. And then it says he gave them to the disciples, the food, the bread. As he's breaking it up, he gave it to the disciples again and again to set before them. Now, what does that mean? The verb that is used here is the imperfect tense again. There was an ongoing action. And it appears to be suggestive of the fact that as Jesus was breaking the bread and giving it to the disciples, they would go and distribute it, come back, and then Jesus would give them more food. And what's happening miraculously is these 5 loaves are multiplying as he's breaking them. We don't know exactly how that worked, what that did. That's why it's a miracle. But they keep coming back again and again. So they're going back and forth. The 12 of them are giving food to the different people, and then they're coming back and getting more from Jesus, and they're going back out and giving the food back and back, back and forth, back and forth. Visualize that. Again, once you know the number, you're going to be even more amazed at how much time it would have taken to do this, how much effort was taking, and then how miraculous was this miracle. As I said, the New American Standard says they were doing it again and again. One could envision, as I said, Jesus breaking the bread, giving to the disciples to distribute to the people, returning, giving to the people, returning, getting more food and giving to the people. And then Mark says this, it happened not only with the bread, but then it also happened with the fish as well. Notice then how this is playing out. This large crowd is being fed by these 2 fish and these 5 loaves. Notice what Mark says in the end, that they received, set it before them, set the food before them, and they did this with the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. Well, what was the result? We look real quickly at verses 42 to 44, the end results. Verse 42, I think is pretty succinct. They ate and were satisfied. And notice even more specifically, it says they all ate and were satisfied. After all the conversation between Jesus and his disciples, with the disciples eventually doing as Jesus said, the rest of Mark's narrative is pretty matter of fact. It's straightforward and quick. We've had all this build up and then it's done. And here's the result. Here's the follow-up, if you will. Mark said succinctly that they all ate and were satisfied. Mark did add a detail beyond saying everyone ate. Notice that they were also satisfied. They were full. What's also interesting, as a byproduct or as a byline, they were originally, the disciples were wanting to send the people away so they can eat. When Jesus said, you get them, he says, they said 200 denarii. Is that, are we to do that to buy bread? They were thinking only of bread. But Jesus then sees what they have is not just bread, but fish. Now they have not just bread, which would not fully satisfy. It would fill your belly for a little bit, but also the fish. They were satisfied. He had taken the 5 loaves, the 2 fish, and provided enough food for all in attendance. It would have been miraculous enough for the loaves and fish to be multiplied to a size that each person could have merely a crumb and just a little, but it didn't stop there. The food was in abundance, and everyone who ate did so to their fill, to their full. So at this point, we aren't told, again, how many ate to their fill. Just everybody who ate was full. From the outset of the narrative, an increasingly large crowd followed Jesus and listened to his teachings. Mark saved the number of the group to the end of his narrative. Before he even gets there, though, he tells us, despite the fact they started with only 5 loaves and 2 fish, when it was all said and done and everyone ate to their fill, it says in verse 43, and they picked up 12 full baskets of the broken pieces of bread and fish. So Jesus had multiplied the loaves and fish above and beyond even what was needed for everyone to eat to their fill. Leftovers abounded to such an extent that the disciples gathered 12 full baskets, picked up 12 full baskets of broken pieces of the loaves, And then, of course, there was even leftovers of the fish. So you might even say there was even a greater miracle with the fish. 5 loaves, but only 2 fish. That 12 loaves is going to be a significant thing, or that 12 baskets is going to be a significant thing in the Gospel of John. Here we'll just say that this is emblematic of Jesus being able to do above and beyond what is needed. And there will be an object lesson in the fact that there were the 12 baskets full with the bread and the fish. So Jesus does above and beyond. Now, the last thing that Mark says, there were 5,000 men who ate the loaves. So let's unpack that real quickly, and then we'll bring in the fact that even that's not the total number. Well, after general indications of the size of the crowd given throughout the narrative, in this last statement regarding Jesus feeding the crowd, Mark finally reveals how many were fed. There were 5,000 men who ate the loaves. The word for men in this verse refers specifically to males. It's not the generic word that typically means person, and generally is also inclusive of male and female. The word anthropos is person. It could be male or female. Here it's aner. Mark does not include reference to women and children, though the way he reports the number, it could imply their presence. If he's saying this is how many men were fed, that's just telling you the men. The implication is clearly the crowd would have had women and children, and we'll see in a moment that Matthew is much more specific. Luke's and John's accounts use the same word for men in the number of people fed, also again without mentioning the women and children. Go look at Luke 9:14 and John 6:10. Matthew, however, says that there were 5,000 men, but he alone goes on to qualify that by saying the number was exclusive of women and children. Let me rephrase that. When he says that there were 5,000 men that were fed, he says besides women and children. Go look at Matthew 14:21. It is reasonable to believe the number of people whom Jesus fed was at least double that, possibly triple. Now, we can't speculate because we don't know that every man brought his wife and we don't know how many children were there. But when it's 5,000 men alone, including women and children, or exclusive of women and children, we know that Jesus fed 5,000 men plus however many thousand women and children. Incidentally, in reporting the number of people who ate, Mark mentioned only that they ate the loaves. He did not mention fish as he did when discussing the leftovers. Of course, however, they all ate both loaves and fish. So we have this great miracle. Jesus starts off trying to get rest, and now he gives food to others. So a summation real quickly. Mark has given the details of numerous miraculous deeds by Jesus throughout his ministry. Chapters 1 through 3, he cast out an unclean spirit from a man in a synagogue. His miracles of healing included Peter's mother-in-law, a leper, a paralyzed man, a man with a shriveled hand. Chapters 4 through 7, the focus of our current study as we're looking. Jesus stilled the storm, again cast out unclean spirits. Think of Legion in the area of the Gadarenes. He healed a woman with bleeding, and he raised a girl from the dead. In addition, Mark made general summary statements about Jesus casting out demons and healing the sick. And most recently, even his disciples have cast out demons and healed the sick on their mission. We see them come back, and now they're ministering together. Many of the miracles Mark records are found in other gospels as well, but the feeding of the 5,000, as we said before, the feeding of the 5,000 men, plus women and children, is the only miracle Jesus performed during his ministry that all 4 gospels include. There was significance regarding the identity of Jesus in this narrative yet to be grasped. When he stilled the storm, there was the question of, what kind of man is this that can do this? Jesus stills or feeds the 5,000 plus, and there's an identity issue. This is going to lead to a point where they will ask, who is this Jesus? Now, in our study of the Gospel of Mark 4 through 7, we won't get to that point where Jesus then asks the disciples who the people say that he is and who they say that he is. But we have a hint of that already, because when Jesus sends the disciples on their mission, speculation about the identity of Jesus arises among the people, and Herod, who had John the Baptist killed, is among those who believe that Jesus is John the Baptist from the dead. Others say he was one of the prophets of old. There's already that growing speculation. What Jesus does as he feeds the 5,000 then, he says he's making identification of who he is. John's account goes on to tell us that after Jesus fed the 5,000 and the people pursued him to make him king, Jesus gave the bread of life discourse, whereby Jesus shows that his ability to provide bread for our physical needs serves to demonstrate his ability to provide salvation for our spiritual needs. Many of these miracles, if not all of them, are an analogy. He can do this, but that just demonstrates that he can do this. He can heal you. He can give you eternal life. Here, he can feed you. He can provide you abundant life. In all four Gospels, soon hereafter comes a time for the disciples to declare who they believe Jesus to be. As I said, we won't get there in this lesson, in this unit. In the meantime, as we'll see, there is more teaching and healing yet to come. What have I done? As we've gone through this, I've tried to emphasize not only the way that Mark is telling the story, but the way Mark tells the story and what he's trying to convey to us. Ultimately, we need to be thinking about who Jesus is. What is he? Who can do this kind of thing? They're amazed at this, as we'll see. Well, in closing, what we have here is that Jesus guided the disciples through their ministry, tried to give them an opportunity for their needs to be met in the process. He originally was taking them to a secluded place, as we said. That didn't happen. They ended up in a secluded place. They went to eat. But what's interesting is the disciples eventually get to eat if they ate with the crowds. But they ate along with the crowds as well. When asked by Jesus to do something, we have to ask ourselves by way of application, do we think about how we can or can't do it, or do we trust him that he will work with us through our obedience? And I made a quick transition there from the historical aspect to the modern aspect. But we would need to be thinking about Jesus preparing us for ministry. Definitely a time to rest, definitely a time to be flexible, but also recognizing that when Jesus asks us to do something, as he did with the disciples, are we ready to just let him supply? We need to trust him for that. We can think about doing it with our own power, and we need to cooperate with Jesus, but we need to recognize Jesus can empower us to do this. He can help us. Jesus' compassion on the crowd entailed meeting their spiritual needs, teaching them the many things, and it entailed their physical needs, giving them bread and fish. Jesus therefore modeled for the disciples how to have compassion and how to follow up on it. Not just enough to say, be fed, they fed them. They experienced a bit of this on their respective missions, as we saw in Mark 6, verses 7 to 13. They went out and preached, they went out and healed, they went out and cast demons. They witnessed more examples of this upon their return when Jesus fed the 5,000. Jesus has called believers today to join him on mission as well. We must rely on him for his provision and have a willing spirit to do as he instructs, even if we don't know what that will mean. We need to trust that he knows what he's doing. We never will know what he will allow us to see unless we do. In that, we learn more and more about who he is, and even as the disciples did in this event and would continue to do in the next, we will grow in our understanding of him. A couple of things in conclusion. If you don't know the Lord, I want you to know that Jesus meets your needs. Now, this is not some just generic practical self-help kind of thing of getting something from Jesus in the now. I want you to see examples of Jesus meeting physical needs as a demonstration that he meets spiritual needs. We know in the hierarchy of things, your spiritual need is most important. Your physical need is most immediate, and Jesus is able to meet both of those. For those of you who are believers, the point is that we are called to follow Jesus' example in sharing the gospel with people, teaching them about the kingdom, meeting needs when we can. We know that we're not going to have the miraculous powers unless God somehow decides to work through us in that way. But he has provided other means for us to show compassion on people and meet their needs. Ultimately, of course, we want to share the gospel with them, and that entails demonstrating how through these meeting of physical needs, there is the greater need of the spiritual need. We can't separate those. Along the way, we are in awe and wonder at who Jesus is and who he was. Go back and read the text carefully again. And yes, be in awe of Jesus' miraculous power. And then just know that we need to be obedient to what he's called us to do and allow him to work. I can think of many scenarios where people are seeking to work the work of God, and they're wondering where in the world are they going to get the funds or the ability to do what God's called them to do. We need to trust and let God do his work and seek how God will do that. Just ask God, how are you going to have us do this? And then let him work. The feeding of the 5,000, the only miracle of Jesus during his ministry recorded in all four Gospels. It's significant. This is leading up to a significant question about who Jesus is and what Mark is doing and each of the other Gospels has done. is giving you things to think about, what kind of man this is. And in the end, we realize he's not just a man, he's God in the flesh. I want to invite you to follow him today. And if you are a follower already, I want to invite you to continue to be obedient to him and seek after him and ask him what he would have you do in service to him. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this day. And we just ask right now that we can rejoice in how you've met needs. Many watching, myself included, have needs. And we pray that you will meet those needs. We also pray that you help us to be obedient, to know who it is that we would serve, how it is we would serve, and what it is we would do in service to you. We just seek with anticipation how you are going to use us. I pray that people will come to know you and give their life to you. They will enjoy the everlasting life, the eternal life that begins upon belief and trust in you, and that you will guide and direct them and meet their needs. Lord, we do pray for meeting of physical needs, even as you met the needs of the crowds that gathered to hear Jesus. And I pray that you will do that in our lives. Pray that you'll do that in the people that we touch. And then help us to live our days each day seeking the kingdom, preaching the kingdom, helping meet others' needs, to demonstrate the compassion that Jesus did. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at what's coming up in the next lesson. As always, we're going passage by passage here. Our next lesson is Don't Be Afraid. Mark chapter 6, verses 45 to 53. What we're going to see here is another event on the water. What we're seeing is Jesus had stilled the storms before. Now, after feeding the 5,000, they're going to get on a boat and go to another place. And we're going to see another event on the water. And of course, as you can see by the title, Don't Be Afraid, something's going to happen to make the disciples fear. Mark's going to give us a brief description and discussion about Jesus walking on the water. Well, until our next lesson, I pray that the Lord bless you and keep you, that he make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Pray that he lift up his face to you and give you peace.